Story 61, Household Tales by Jacob and Willem Grimm. The Little Peasant. There was a certain village wherein no one lived but really rich peasants, and just one poor one, whom they called the Little Peasant. He had not yet even so much as a cow, and still less money to buy one, and yet he and his wife did so wish to have one. One day he said to her, "Hark you, I have a good thought. There is our gossip, the carpenter. He shall make us a wooden calf, and paint it brown, so that it look like any other, and in time it will certainly get big and be a cow." The woman also liked the idea, and their gossip, the carpenter, cut and planed the calf, and painted it as it ought to be, and made it with its head hanging down as if it were eating. Next morning, when the cows were being driven out, the little peasant called the cowherd and said, "Look, I have a little calf there, but it is still small and has still to be carried." The cowherd said, "All right," and took it in his arms and carried it to the pasture and set it among the grass. The little calf always remained standing like one which was eating, and the cowherd said, "It will soon run alone. Just look how it eats already." At night, when he was going to drive the herd home again, he said to the calf, "If thou canst stand there and eat thy fill, thou canst also go on thy 4 legs. I don't care to drag thee home again in my arms." But the little peasant stood at his door and waited for his calf, and when the cowherd drove the cows through the village, and the calf was missing, he inquired where it was. The cowherd answered, "It is still standing out there eating. It would not stop and come with us." But the little peasant said, "Oh, but I must have my beast back again." Then they went back to the meadow together, but someone had stolen the calf, and it was gone. The cowherd said, "It must have run away." The peasant, however, said, "Don't tell me that," and led the cowherd before the mayor, who, for his carelessness, condemned him to give the peasant a cow for the calf which had run away. And now the little peasant and his wife had the cow, for which they had so long wished, and they were heartily glad. But they had no food for it, and could give it nothing to eat, so it soon had to be killed. They salted the flesh, and the peasant went into the town and wanted to sell the skin there, so that he might buy a new calf with the proceeds. On the way, he passed by a mill, and there sat a raven with broken wings. And out of pity he took him and wrapped him in the skin. As, however, the weather grew so bad, and there was a storm of rain and wind, he could go no farther, and turned back to the mill and begged for shelter. The miller's wife was alone in the house, and said to the peasant, "Lay thyself on the straw there," and gave him a slice of bread with cheese on it. The peasant ate it, and lay down with his skin beside him, and the woman thought, "He is tired and has gone to sleep." In the meantime came the parson. The miller's wife received him well and said, "My husband is out, so we will have a feast." The peasant listened, and when he heard about feasting, he was vexed that he had been forced to make shift with a slice of bread with cheese on it. Then the woman served up 4 different things: roast meat, salad, cakes, and wine. Just as they were about to sit down and eat, there was a knocking outside. The woman said, "Oh heavens, it is my husband." She quickly hid the roast meat inside the tiled stove, the wine under the pillow, the salad on the bed, and the cakes under it, and the parson in the cupboard in the entrance. Then she opened the door for her husband and said, "Thank heaven thou art back again. There is such a storm, it looks as if the world were coming to an end." The miller saw the peasant lying on the straw, and asked, "What is that fellow doing there?" "Ah," said the wife, "the poor knave came in the storm and rain and begged for shelter. So he gave him a bit of bread and cheese and showed him where the straw was. The man said, "I have no objection, but be quick and get me something to eat." The woman said, "But I have nothing but bread and cheese." "I am contented with anything," replied the husband. "So far as I am concerned, bread and cheese will do," and looked at the peasant and said, "Come and eat some more with me." The peasant did not require to be invited twice, but got up and ate. After this, the miller saw the skin in which the raven was lying on the ground and asked, "What hast thou there?" The peasant answered, "I have a soothsayer inside it." "Can he foretell anything to me?" said the miller. "Why not?" asked the peasant. "But he only says 4 things, and the 5th he keeps to himself." The miller was curious and said, "Let him foretell something at once." Then the peasant pinched the raven's head so that he croaked and made a noise like "Grr, grr." The miller said, "What did he say?" The peasant answered, "In the first place, he says that there is some wine hidden under the pillow." "Bless me," cried the miller, and went there and found the wine. "Now go on," said he. The peasant made the raven croak again and said, "In the second place, he says that there is some roast meat in the tiled stove." "Upon my word," cried the miller, and went thither and found the roast meat. The peasant made the raven prophesy still more and said, "Thirdly, he says there is some salad on the bed." "That would be a fine thing," cried the miller, and went there and found the salad. At last the peasant pinched the raven once more till he croaked and said, "Fourthly, he says that there are some cakes under the bed." "That would be a fine thing," cried the miller, and looked there and found the cakes. And now the two sat down to the table together, but the miller's wife was frightened to death, and went to bed and took all the keys with her. The miller would have liked much to know the 5th, but the little peasant said, "First, we will quickly eat the 4 things, for the 5th is something bad." So they ate, and after that they bargained how much the miller was to give for the 5th prophecy, until they agreed on 300 thalers. Then the peasant once more pinched the raven's head till he croaked loudly. The miller said, "What did he say?" The peasant replied, "He says that the devil is hiding outside there in the cupboard in the entrance." The miller said, "The devil must go out," and opened the house door. Then the woman was forced to give up the keys, and the peasant unlocked the cupboard. The parson ran out as fast as he could, and the miller said, "It was true, I saw the black rascal with my own eyes." The peasant, however, made off next morning by daybreak with the 300 thalers. At home, the small peasant gradually launched out. He built a beautiful house, and the peasants said, "The small peasant has certainly been to the place where the golden snow falls, and people carry the gold home in shovels." Then the small peasant was brought before the mayor, and bidden to say from whence his wealth came. He answered, "I sold my cow's skin in the town for 300 thalers. When the peasants heard that, they too wished to enjoy this great profit, and ran home, killed all their cows, and stripped off their skins in order to sell them in the town to the greatest advantage. The mayor, however, said, "But my servant must go first." When she came to the merchant in the town, he did not give her more than 2 thalers for a skin. And when the others came, he did not give them so much, and said, "What can I do with all these skins?" Then the peasants were vexed that the small peasant should have thus overreached them, wanted to take vengeance on him, and accused him of this treachery before the mayor. The innocent little peasant was unanimously sentenced to death, and was to be rolled into the water in a barrel pierced full of holes. He was led forth, and a priest was brought who was to say a mass for his soul. The others were all obliged to retire to a distance, and when the peasant looked at the priest, he recognized the man who had been with the miller's wife. He said to him, "I set you free from the cupboard. Set me free from the barrel." At this same moment up came with a flock of sheep the very shepherd who, as the peasant knew, had long been wishing to be mayor. So he cried with all his might, "No, I will not do it. If the whole world insists on it, I will not do it." The shepherd, hearing that, came up to him and asked, "What art thou about? What is it that thou wilt not do?" The peasant said, "They want to make me mayor if I will put myself in the barrel, but I will not do it." The shepherd said, "If nothing more than that is needful in order to be mayor, I would get into the barrel at once." The peasant said, "If thou wilt get in, thou wilt be mayor." The shepherd was willing and got in, and the peasant shut the top down on him. Then he took the shepherd's flock for himself and drove it away. The parson went to the crowd and declared that the mass had been said. Then they came and rolled the barrel towards the water. When the barrel began to roll, the shepherd cried, "I am quite willing to be mayor." They believed no otherwise than that it was the peasant who was saying this, and answered, "That is what we intend, but first thou shalt look about thee a little down below there." And they rolled the barrel into the water. After that the peasants went home, and as they were entering the village, the small peasant also came quietly in, driving a flock of sheep and looking quite contented. Then the peasants were astonished and said, "Peasant, from whence comest thou? Hast thou come out of the water?" "Yes, truly," cried the peasant. "I sank deep, deep down, until at last I got to the bottom. I pushed the bottom out of the barrel and crept out, and there were pretty meadows on which a number of lambs were feeding, and from thence I brought this flock away with me." Said the peasants, "Are there any more there?" "Oh, yes," said he, "more than I could do anything with." Then the peasants made up their mind that they too would fetch some sheep for themselves, a flock apiece. But the mayor said, "I come first." So they went to the water together, and just then there was some of the small fleecy clouds in the blue sky, which are called little lambs, and they were reflected in the water. Whereupon the peasants cried, "We already see the sheep down below." The mayor pressed forward and said, "I will get down first and look about me, and if things promise well, I'll call you." So he jumped in. Splash went the water. He made a sound as if he were calling them, and the whole crowd plunged in after him as one man. Then the entire village was dead, and the small peasant, as sole heir, became a rich man. End of story 61.
Story number 62 of Household Tales by Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm, The Queen Bee. Two kings' sons once went out in search of adventures and fell into a wild, disorderly way of living, so that they never came home again. The youngest, who was called Simpleton, set out to seek his brothers, but when at length he found them, they mocked him for thinking that he with his simplicity could get through the world, when they who could not make their way, and yet they were so much cleverer. They all three traveled away together, and came to an ant-hill. The two elder wanted to destroy it, to see the little ants creeping about in their terror and carrying their eggs away. But Simpleton said, "Leave the creatures in peace. I will not allow you to disturb them." Then they went onwards and came to a lake, on which a great number of ducks were swimming. The two brothers wanted to catch a couple and roast them, but Simpleton would not permit it, and said, "Leave the creatures in peace. I will not suffer you to kill them." At length they came to a bee's nest, in which there was so much honey that it ran out of the trunk of the tree where it was. The two wanted to make a fire beneath the tree and suffocate the bees in order to take away the honey, but Simpleton again stopped them and said, "Leave the creatures in peace. I will not allow you to burn them." At length the three brothers arrived at a castle, where stone horses were standing in the stables, and no human being was to be seen. And they went through all the halls until quite at the end they came to a door in which were 3 locks. In the middle of the door, however, there was a little pane, through which they could see into the room. There they saw a little gray man who was sitting at a table. They called him once, twice, but he did not hear. At last they called him for the 3rd time. When he got up, opened the locks, and came out, he said nothing, however, but conducted them to a handsomely spread table, and when they had eaten and drunk, he took each of them to a bedroom. Next morning the little gray man came to the eldest, beckoned to him, and conducted him to a stone table on which were inscribed 3 tasks, by the performance of which the castle could be delivered. The first was that in the forest beneath the moss lay the princess's pearls, 1,000 in number, which must be picked up, and if by sunset 1 single pearl was wanting, he who had looked for them would be turned into stone. The eldest went thither and sought the whole day, but when it came to an end he had only found 100, and what was written on the table came to pass, and he was changed into stone. The next day the second brother undertook the adventure. It did not, however, fare much better with him than with the eldest. He did not find more than 200 pearls, and was changed to stone. At last the turn came to Simpleton also, who sought in the moss. It was, however, so hard to find the pearls, and he got on so slowly, that he seated himself on a stone and wept. And while he was thus sitting, the king of the ants, whose life he had once saved, came with 5,000 ants, and before long the little creatures had got all the pearls together and laid them in a heap. The second task, however, was to fetch out of the lake the key of the king's daughter's bedchamber. When Simpleton came to the lake, the ducks which he had saved swam up to him, dived down, and brought the key out of the water. But the third task was the most difficult. From amongst the 3 sleeping daughters of the king was the youngest and dearest to be sought out. They, however, resembled each other exactly, and were only to be distinguished by having eaten different sweetmeats before they fell asleep. The eldest a bit of sugar, the second a little syrup, and the youngest a spoonful of honey. Then the queen of the bees, which Simpleton had protected from the fire, came and tasted the lips of all 3, and at last she remained sitting on the mouth which had eaten honey, and thus the king's son recognized the right princess. Then the enchantment was at an end. Everything was released from sleep, and those who had been turned into stone received once more their natural forms. Simpleton married the youngest and sweetest princess, and after her father's death became king, and his 2 brothers received the 2 other sisters. End of story number 62.
Story 63 of Household Tales. The 3 Feathers. There was once on a time a king who had 3 sons, of whom 2 were clever and wise, but the third did not speak much, and was simple, and was called the Simpleton. When the king had become old and weak, and was thinking of his end, he did not know which of his sons should inherit the kingdom after him. Then he said to them, "Go forth, and he who brings me the most beautiful carpet shall be king after my death." And that there would be no dispute amongst them, he took them outside his castle, blew 3 feathers into the air, and said, "You shall go as they fly." 1 feather flew to the east, the other to the west, but the third flew straight up and did not fly far, but soon fell to the ground. And now 1 brother went to the right, and the other to the left, and they mocked Simpleton, who was forced to stay where the 3rd feather had fallen. He sat down and was sad. Then all at once he saw that there was a trap door close by the feather. He raised it up, found some steps, and went down them. And then he came to another door, knocked at it, and heard somebody inside calling, "Little green maiden small, hopping hither and thither, hop to the door and quickly see who is there." The door opened, and he saw a great fat toad sitting, and round about her a crowd of little toads. The fat toad asked what he wanted. He answered, I should like to have the prettiest and finest carpet in the world." Then she called a young one and said, "Little green maiden small, hopping hither and thither, hop quickly and bring me the great box here." The young toad brought the box, and the fat toad opened it, and gave Simpleton a carpet out of it, so beautiful and so fine that on the earth above none could have been woven like it. Then he thanked her and ascended again. The two others had, however, looked on their youngest brother as so stupid that they believed he would find and bring nothing at all. "Why should we give ourselves a great deal of trouble to search?" said they, and got some coarse handkerchiefs from the first shepherds' wives whom they met, and carried them home to the king. At the same time Simpleton also came back, and brought his beautiful carpet. And when the king saw it, he was astonished, and said, "If justice be done, the kingdom belongs to the youngest." But the two others let their father have no peace, and said that it was impossible that Simpleton, who in everything lacked understanding, should be king, and entreated him to make a new agreement with them. Then the father said, "He who brings me the most beautiful ring shall inherit the kingdom," and led the three brothers out, and blew into the air 3 feathers which they were to follow. Those of the two eldest again went east and west, and Simpleton's feather flew straight up, and fell down near the door into the earth. Then he went down again to the fat toad, and told her that he wanted the most beautiful ring. She at once ordered her great box to be brought, and gave him a ring out of it, which sparkled with jewels, and was so beautiful that no goldsmith on earth could have been able to make it. The two eldest laughed at Simpleton for going to seek a golden ring. They gave themselves no trouble, but knocked the nails out of an old carriage ring and took it to the king. But when Simpleton produced his golden ring, his father again said, "The kingdom belongs to him." The two eldest did not cease from tormenting the king until he made a third condition, and declared that the one who brought the most beautiful woman home should have the kingdom. He again blew 3 feathers into the air, and they flew as before. Then Simpleton, without more ado, went down to the fat toad, and said, "I am to take home the most beautiful woman." "Oh," answered the toad, "the most beautiful woman. She is not at hand at the moment, but still thou shalt have her." She gave him a yellow turnip, which had been hollowed out, to which 6 mice were harnessed. Then Simpleton said, quite mournfully, "What am I to do with that?" The toad answered, "Just put one of my little toads into it." Then he seized one at random out of the circle, and put her into the yellow coach. But hardly was she seated inside it than she turned into a wonderfully beautiful maiden, and the turnip into a coach, and the 6 mice into horses. So he kissed her, and drove off quickly with the horses, and took her to the king. His brothers came afterwards. They had given themselves no trouble at all to seek beautiful girls, but had brought with them the first peasant women they chanced to meet. When the king saw them, he said, "After my death, the kingdom belongs to my youngest son." But the two eldest deafened the king's ears afresh with their clamor. "We cannot consent to Simpleton's being king," and demanded that the one whose wife could leap through a ring which hung in the center of the hall should have the preference. They thought, "The peasant women can do that easily. They are strong enough, but the delicate maiden will jump herself to death." The aged king agreed likewise to this. Then the 2 peasant women jumped, and jumped through the ring, but were so stout that they fell, and their coarse arms and legs broke in 2. And then the pretty maiden, whom Simpleton had brought with him, sprang through as lightly as a deer. And all opposition had to cease. So he received the crown, and has ruled wisely for a length of time. End of Story 63.
Story 64 of Household Tales. The Golden Goose. There was a man who had 3 sons, the youngest of whom was called Dummling, and was despised, mocked, and put down on every occasion. It happened that the eldest wanted to go into the forest to hew wood, and before he went, his mother gave him a beautiful sweet cake and a bottle of wine, in order that he might not suffer from hunger or thirst. When he entered the forest, there met him a little gray-haired old man who bade him good day and said, "Do give me a piece of cake out of your pocket, and let me have a draught of your wine. I am so hungry and thirsty." But the prudent youth answered, "If I give you my cake and wine, I shall have none for myself. Be off with you." And he left the little man standing and went on. But when he began to hew down a tree, it was not long before he made a false stroke, and the axe cut him in the arm, so that he had to go home and have it bound up. And this was the little gray man's doing. After this, the second son went into the forest, and his mother gave him, like the eldest, a cake and a bottle of wine. The little old gray man met him likewise, and asked him for a piece of cake and a drink of wine. But the second son, too, said with much reason, "What I give you will be taken away from myself. Be off." And he left the little man standing and went on. His punishment, however, was not delayed. When he had made a few strokes at the tree, he struck himself in the leg, so that he had to be carried home. Then Dummling said, "Father, do let me go and cut wood." The father answered, "Your brothers have hurt themselves with it. Leave it alone. You do not understand anything about it." But Dummling begged so long that at last he said, "Just go then. You will get wiser by hurting yourself." His mother gave him a cake made with water and baked in the cinders, and with a bottle of sour beer. When he came to the forest, the little old gray man met him likewise and greeted him, said, "Give me a piece of your cake and a drink out of your bottle. I am so hungry and thirsty." Dummling answered, "I have only cinder cake and sour beer. If that pleases you, we will sit down and eat." So they sat down, and when Dummling pulled out his cinder cake, it was a fine sweet cake, and the sour beer had become good wine. So they ate and drank, and after that the little man said, "Since you have a good heart, and are willing to divide what you have, I will give you good luck. There stands an old tree. Cut it down, and you will find something at the roots." Then the little man took leave of him. Dummling went and cut down the tree, and when it fell there was a goose sitting in the roots, with feathers of pure gold. He lifted her up, and taking her with him, went to an inn where he thought he would stay the night. Now the host had 3 daughters, who saw the goose and were curious to know what such a wonderful bird might be, and would have liked to have one of its golden feathers. The eldest thought, "I shall soon find an opportunity of pulling out a feather," and as soon as Dummling had gone out, she seized the goose by the wing, but her finger had remained sticking fast to it. The second came soon afterwards, thinking only of how she might get a feather for herself, and she had scarcely touched her sister than she was held fast. At last the third also came with the like intent, and the others screamed out, "Keep away, for goodness sake, keep away!" But she did not understand why she was to keep away. "The others are there," she thought, "I may as well be there too," and ran to them. But as soon as she had touched her sister, she remained sticking fast to her, so they had to spend the night with the goose. The next morning, Dummling took the goose under his arm and set out, without troubling himself about the 3 girls who were hanging on to it. They were obliged to run after him continually, now left, now right, just as he was inclined to go. In the middle of the fields, the parson met them, and when he saw the procession, he said, "For shame, you good-for-nothing girls! Why are you running across the fields after this young man? Is that seemly?" At the same time he seized the youngest by the hand in order to pull her away, but as soon as he touched her, he likewise stuck fast, and was himself obliged to run behind. Before long the sexton came and saw his master, the parson, running behind 3 girls. He was astonished at this, and called out, "Hi, your reverence! Whither away so quickly?" do not forget that we have a christening today." And, running after him, he took him by the sleeve, but was also held fast to it. Whilst the 5 were trotting thus one behind the other, 2 laborers came with their hoes from the fields. The parson called out to them and begged that they would set him and the sexton free. But they had scarcely touched the sexton when they were held fast, and now there were 7 of them running behind Dummling and the goose. Soon afterwards he came to a city where a king ruled who had a daughter who was so serious that no one could make her laugh. So he had put forth a decree that whosoever should be able to make her laugh should marry her. When Dummling heard this, he went with his goose and all her train before the king's daughter. As soon as she saw the 7 people running on and on, one behind the other, she began to laugh quite loudly, and as if she would never leave off. Thereupon Dummling asked to have her for his wife, and the wedding was celebrated. After the king's death, Dummling inherited the kingdom and lived a long time contentedly with his wife. End of story 64.
Story 65 of Household Tales. Household Tales by Jakob and Wilhelm Grimm. Allerlei Rau. There was once on a time a king who had a wife with golden hair, and she was so beautiful that her equal was not to be found on earth. It came to pass that she lay ill, and as she felt that she must soon die, she called the king and said, "If thou wishest to marry again after my death, take no one who is not quite as beautiful as I am, and who has not just such golden hair as I have. This thou must promise me." And after the king had promised this, she closed her eyes and died. For a long time the king could not be comforted, and had no thought of taking another wife. At length his counselors said, "There is no help for it. The king must marry again, that we may have a queen." And now messengers were sent about far and wide to seek a bride who equaled the late queen in beauty. In the whole world, however, none was to be found, and even if one had been found, still there would have been no one who had such golden hair. So the messengers came home as they went. Now the king had a daughter who was just as beautiful as her dead mother, and had the same golden hair. When she was grown up, the king looked at her one day, and saw that in every respect she was like his late wife, and suddenly felt a violent love for her. Then he spake to his counselors, "I will marry my daughter, for she is the counterpart of my late wife. Otherwise I can find no bride who resembles her." When the counselors heard that, they were shocked and said, "God has forbidden a father to marry his daughter. No good can come from such a crime, and the kingdom will be involved in the ruin." The daughter was still more shocked when she became aware of her father's resolution, but hoped to turn him from his design. Then she said to him, "Before I fulfill your wish, I must have 3 dresses, one as golden as the sun, one as silvery as the moon, and one as bright as the stars. Besides this, I wish for a mantle of 1,000 different kinds of fur and hair joined together, and one of every kind of animal in your kingdom must give a piece of his skin for it." But she thought, "To get that will be quite impossible, and thus I shall divert my father from his wicked intentions." The king, however, did not give up, and the cleverest maidens in his kingdom had to weave the 3 dresses, one as golden as the sun, one as silvery as the moon, and one as bright as the stars. And his huntsman had to catch one of every kind of animal in the whole of his kingdom, and take from it a piece of its skin, and out of these was made a mantle of 1,000 different kinds of fur. At length, when all was ready, the king caused the mantle to be brought, spread it out before her, and said, "The wedding shall be tomorrow." When therefore the king's daughter saw that there was no longer any hope of turning her father's heart, she resolved to run away from him. In the night, whilst everyone was asleep, she got up and took 3 different things from her treasures: a golden ring, a golden spinning wheel, and a golden reel. The 3 dresses of the sun, moon, and stars she put into a nutshell, put on her mantle of all kinds of fur, and blackened her face and hands with soot. Then she commended herself to God, and went away, and walked the whole night until she reached a great forest. And as she was tired, she got into a hollow tree and fell asleep. The sun rose, and she slept on, and she was still sleeping when it was full day. Then it so happened that the king to whom this forest belonged was hunting in it. When his dogs came to the tree, they sniffed and ran barking round about it. The king said to the huntsman, "Just see what kind of wild beast has hidden itself in there." The huntsman obeyed his order, and when they came back they said, "A wondrous beast is lying in the hollow tree. We have never before seen one like it. Its skin is fur of 1,000 different kinds, but it is lying asleep." Said the king, "See if you can catch it alive, and then fasten it to the carriage, and we will take it with us." When the huntsman laid hold of the maiden, she awoke full of terror and cried to them, "I am a poor child, deserted by father and mother. Have pity on me, and take me with you." Then they said, "Allerleirauh, thou wilt be useful in the kitchen. Come with us, and thou canst sweep up the ashes." So they put her in the carriage, and took her home to the royal palace. There they pointed out to her a closet under the stairs, where no daylight entered, and said, "Hairy animal, there canst thou live and sleep." Then she was sent into the kitchen, and there she carried wood and water, swept the hearth, plucked the fowls, picked the vegetables, raked the ashes, and did all the dirty work. Allerleirauh lived there for a long time in great wretchedness. Alas, fair princess, what is to become of thee now? It happened, however, that one day a feast was held in the palace, and she said to the cook, "May I go upstairs for a while and look on? I will place myself outside the door." The cook answered, "Yes, go, but you must be back here in half an hour to sweep the hearth." Then she took her oil lamp, went into her den, put off her fur dress, and washed the soot off her face and hands, so that her full beauty once more came to light. And she opened the nut, and took out her dress which shone like the sun. And when she had done that, she went up to the festival, and every one made way for her, for no one knew her, and thought no otherwise than that she was a king's daughter. The king came to meet her, gave his hand to her, and danced with her, and thought in his heart, "My eyes have never yet seen anyone so beautiful." When the dance was over, she curtsied, and when the king looked round again, she had vanished, and none knew whither. The guards who stood outside the palace were called and questioned, but no one had seen her. She had, however, run to her little den, had quickly taken off her dress, made her face and hands black again, put on the fur mantle, and again was Allerleirauh. And now when she went into the kitchen, and was about to get to her work and sweep up the ashes, the cook said, "Leave that alone till morning, and make me the soup for the king. I too will go upstairs a while and take a look, but let no hairs fall in, or in future thou shalt have nothing to eat." So the cook went away, and Allerleirauh made the soup for the king, and made bread soup, and the best she could, and when it was ready, she fetched her golden ring from her little den, and put it in the bowl in which the soup was served. When the dancing was over, the king had his soup brought and ate it, and he liked it so much that it seemed to him he had never tasted better. But when he came to the bottom of the bowl, he saw a golden ring lying, and could not conceive how it could have got there. Then he ordered the cook to appear before him. The cook was terrified when he heard the order, and said to Allerleirauh, "Thou hast certainly let a hair fall into the soup, and if thou hast, thou shalt be beaten for it." When he came before the king, the latter asked who had made the soup. The cook replied, "I made it." But the king said, "That is not true, for it was much better than usual, and cooked differently." He answered, "I must acknowledge that I did not make it. It was made by the rough animal." The king said, "Go and bid it come up here." When Allerleirauh came, the king said, "Who art thou?" "I am a poor girl who no longer has any father or mother." He asked further, "Of what use art thou in my palace?" She answered, "I am good for nothing but to have boots thrown at my head." He continued, "Where didst thou get the ring which was in the soup?" She answered, "I know nothing about the ring." So the king could learn nothing and had to send her away again. After a while there was another festival, and then, as before, Allerleirauh begged the cook for leave to go and look on. He answered, "Yes, but come back again in half an hour and make the king the bread soup which he so much likes." Then she ran into her den, washed herself quickly, and took out of the nut the dress which was as silvery as the moon, and put it on. Then she went up and was like a princess, and the king stepped forward to meet her, and rejoiced to see her once more, and as the dance was just beginning, they danced it together. But when it was ended, she again disappeared so quickly that the king could not observe where she went. She, however, sprang into her den, and once more made herself a hairy animal, and went into the kitchen to prepare the bread soup. When the cook had gone upstairs, she fetched a little golden spinning wheel and put it in the bowl, so that the soup covered it. Then it was taken to the king, who ate it, and liked it as much as before, and had the cook brought, who this time likewise was forced to confess that Allerleirauh had prepared the soup. Allerleirauh again came before the king, but she answered that she was good for nothing else but to have boots thrown at her head, and that she knew nothing at all about the little golden spinning wheel. When for the third time the king held a festival, all happened just as it had done before. The cook said, "Faith, Roughskin, thou art a witch, and always puttest something in the soup which makes it so good that the king likes it better than that which I cook." But as she begged so hard, he let her go up at the appointed time. And now she put on the dress which shone like the stars, and thus entered the hall. Again the king danced with the beautiful maiden, and thought that she never yet had been so beautiful. And whilst she was dancing, he contrived, without her noticing it, to slip a golden ring on her finger, and he had given orders that the dance should last a very long time. When it was ended, he wanted to hold her fast by her hands, but she tore herself loose, and sprang away so quickly through the crowd that she vanished from his sight. She ran as fast as she could into her den beneath the stairs, but as she had been too long and had stayed more than half an hour, she could not take off her pretty dress, but only threw over it her fur mantle, and in her haste she did not make herself quite black, but one finger remained white. Then Allerleirauh ran into the kitchen and cooked the bread soup for the king, and as the cook was away, put her golden reel into it. When the king found the reel at the bottom of it, he caused Allerleirauh to be summoned, and then he espied the white finger, and saw the ring which he had put on it during the dance. Then he grasped her by the hand and held her fast, and when she wanted to release herself and run away, her mantle of fur opened a little, and the star-dress shone forth. The king clutched the mantle and tore it off. Then her golden hair shone forth, and she stood there in full splendor, and could no longer hide herself. And when she had washed the soot and ashes from her face, she was more beautiful than anyone who had ever been seen on earth. But the king said, "Thou art my dear bride, and we will never more part from each other." Thereupon the marriage was solemnized, and they lived happily until their death. End of story 65.
Story number 66 of Household Tales. The Hare's Bride. There was once a woman and her daughter who lived in a pretty garden with cabbages, and a little hare came into it, and during the winter time ate all the cabbages. Then says the mother to the daughter, "Go into the garden and chase the hare away." The girl says to the little hare, "Shh, hare, you are still eating up all our cabbages." Says the hare, "Come, maiden, and seat yourself on my little hare's tail, and come with me into my little hare's hut." The girl will not do it. Next day the hare comes again and eats the cabbages. Then says the mother to the daughter, "Go into the garden and drive the hare away." The girl says to the hare, "Shh, little hare, you are still eating all the cabbages." The little hare says, "Maiden, Seat thyself on my little hare's tail, and come with me into my little hare's hut. The maiden refuses. The third day the hare comes again and eats the cabbages. On this, the mother says to the daughter, Go into the garden and hunt the hare away. Says the maiden, Shh, little hare, you are still eating all our cabbages. Says the little hare, Come, maiden, seat thyself on my little hare's tail, and come with me into my little hare's hut. The girl seats herself on the little hare's tail, and then the hare takes her far away to his little hut and says, Now cook green cabbage and millet seed, and I will invite the wedding guests. Then all the wedding guests assembled. Who were the wedding guests? That I can tell you as another told it to me. They were all hares, and the crow was there as parson to marry the bride and bridegroom, and the fox as clerk, and the altar was under the rainbow. The girl, however, was sad, for she was all alone. The little hare comes and says, Open the doors, open the doors, the wedding guests are merry. The bride says nothing but weeps. The little hare goes away. The little hare comes back and says, Take off the lid, take off the lid, the wedding guests are hungry. The bride again says nothing and weeps. The little hare goes away. The little hare comes back and says, Take off the lid, take off the lid, the wedding guests are waiting. Then the bride says nothing, and the hare goes away. But she dresses a straw doll in her clothes, and gives her a spoon to stir with, and sets her by the pan with the millet seed, and goes back to her mother. The little hare comes once more and says, Take off the lid, take off the lid, and gets up and strikes the doll on the head so that her cap falls off. Then the little hare sees that it is not his bride, and goes away and is sorrowful. End of story number 66.
Story 67 of Household Tales. Household Tales by Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm. Translated by Margaret Hunt. The 12 Huntsmen. There was once a king's son who was betrothed to a maiden whom he loved very much. And when he was sitting beside her and very happy, news came that his father lay sick unto death, and desired to see him once again before his end. Then he said to his betrothed, I must go now and leave thee. I give thee a ring as a remembrance of me. When I am king, I will return and fetch thee. So he rode away, and when he reached his father, the latter was dangerously ill and near his death. He said to him, Dear son, I wish to see thee once again before my end. Promise me to marry as I wish. And he named a certain king's daughter who was to be his wife. The son was in such trouble that he did not think what he was doing, and said, Yes, dear father, your will shall be done. And thereupon the king shut his eyes and died. When therefore the son had been proclaimed king, and the time of mourning was over, he was forced to keep the promise which he had given his father, and caused the king's daughter to be asked in marriage, and she was promised to him. His first betrothed heard of this, and fretted so much about his faithlessness that she nearly died. Then her father said to her, Dearest child, why art thou so sad? Thou shalt have whatsoever thou wilt. She thought for a moment and said, Dear father, I wish for 11 girls exactly like myself in face, figure, and size. The father said, If it be possible, thy desire shall be fulfilled. And he caused a search to be made in his whole kingdom, until 11 young maidens were found who exactly resembled his daughter in face, figure, and size. When they came to the king's daughter, she had 12 suits of huntsmen's clothes made, all alike, and the 11 maidens had to put on the huntsman's clothes, and she herself put on the 12th suit. Thereupon she took leave of her father, and rode away with them, and rode to the court of her former betrothed, whom she loved so dearly. Then she inquired if he required any huntsmen, and if he would take the whole of them into his service. The king looked at her, and did not know her, but as they were such handsome fellows, he said, Yes, and that he would willingly take them, and now they were the king's 12 huntsmen. The king, however, had a lion, which was a wondrous animal, for he knew all concealed and secret things. It came to pass that one evening he said to the king, Thou thinkest thou hast 12 huntsmen? Yes, said the king, they are 12 huntsmen. The lion continued, Thou art mistaken, they are 12 girls. The king said, That cannot be true. How wilt thou prove that to me?" "Oh, just let some peas be strewn in thy antechamber," answered the lion, "and then thou wilt soon see it. Men have a firm step, and when they walk over the peas none of them stir, but girls trip and skip and drag their feet, and the peas roll about." The king was well pleased with the counsel, and caused the peas to be strewn. There was, however, a servant of the king's who favored the huntsmen, and when he heard that they were going to be put to this test, he went to them and repeated everything, and said, "The lion wants to make the king believe that you are girls." Then the king's daughter thanked him, and said to her maidens, "Put on some strength, and step firmly on the peas." So next morning, when the king had the 12 huntsmen called before him, and they came into the antechamber where the peas were lying, they stepped so firmly on them, and had such a strong, sure walk, that not one of the peas either rolled or stirred. Then they went away again, and the king said to the lion, "Thou hast lied to me. They walk just like men." The lion said, "They have got to know that they were going to be put to the test, and have assumed some strength. Just let 12 spinning wheels be brought into the antechamber some day, and they will go to them and be pleased with them, and that is what no man would do." The king liked the advice, and had the spinning wheels placed in the antechamber. But the servant, who was well disposed to the huntsmen, went to them and disclosed the project. Then, when they were alone, the king's daughter said to her 11 girls, "Put some constraint on yourselves, and do not look round at the spinning wheels." And next morning, when the king had his 12 huntsmen summoned, they went through the antechamber, and never once looked at the spinning wheels. Then the king again said to the lion, "Thou hast deceived me. They are men, for they have not looked at the spinning wheels." The lion replied, "They have learnt that they were going to be put to the test, and have restrained themselves." The king, however, would no longer believe the lion. The 12 huntsmen always followed the king to the chase, and his liking for them continually increased. Now it came to pass that once when they were out hunting, news came that the king's betrothed was approaching. When the true bride heard that, it hurt her so much that her heart was almost broken, and she fell fainting to the ground. The king thought something had happened to his dear huntsman, ran up to him, wanted to help him, and drew his glove off. Then he saw the ring which he had given to his first bride, and when he looked in her face he recognized her. Then his heart was so touched that he kissed her, and when she opened her eyes he said, "Thou art mine, and I am thine, and no one in the world can alter that." He sent a messenger to the other bride, and entreated her to return to her own kingdom, for he had a wife already, and a man who had just found an old dish did not require a new one. Thereupon the wedding was celebrated, and the lion was again taken into favor, because, after all, he had told the truth. End of story 67.
Story number 68 of Household Tales, The Thief and His Master. Hans wished to put his son to learn a trade, so he went into the church and prayed to our Lord God to know which would be most advantageous for him. Then the clerk got behind the altar and said, "Thieving, thieving." On this, Hans goes back to his son and tells him he is to learn thieving, and that the Lord God said so. So he goes with his son to seek a man who is acquainted with thieving. They walk a long time and come into a great forest where stands a little house with an old woman in it. Hans says, "Do you know of a man who is acquainted with thieving?" "You can learn that here quite well," says the woman. "My son is a master of it." So he speaks with the son and asks if he knows thieving really well. The master thief says, "I will teach him well. Come back when a year is over, and then if you recognize your son, I will take no payment at all for teaching him. But if you don't know him, you must give me 200 thalers. The father goes home again, and the son learns witchcraft and thieving thoroughly. When the year is out, the father is full of anxiety to know how he is to contrive to recognize his son. As he is thus going about in his trouble, he meets a little dwarf who says, "Man, what ails you, that you are always in such trouble?" "Oh," says Hans, "a year ago I placed my son with a master thief who told me I was to come back when the year was out, and that if I then did not know my son when I saw him, I was to pay 200 thalers, But if I did know him, I was to pay nothing. And now I'm afraid of not knowing him and can't tell where I am to get the money." Then the dwarf tells him to take a small basket of bread with him and to stand beneath the chimney. There on the cross beam is a basket, out of which a little bird is peeping, and that is your son. Hans goes thither and throws a little basket full of black bread in front of the basket, with the bird in it, and the little bird comes out and looks up. "Hello, my son, art thou here?" says the father, and the son is delighted to see his father, but the master thief says, "The devil must have prompted you, or how could you have known your son? Father, let us go," said the youth. Then the father and son set out homeward. On the way a carriage comes driving by. Hereupon the son says to his father, "I will change myself into a large greyhound, and then you can earn a great deal of money by me." Then the gentleman calls from the carriage, "My man, will you sell your dog?" "Yes," says the father. "How much do you want for it?" 30 thalers. Man, that is a great deal. But as it is such a very fine dog, I will have it." The gentleman takes it into his carriage, and when they have driven a little farther, the dog springs out of the carriage through the window and goes back to his father and is no longer a greyhound. They go home together. Next day there is a fair in the neighboring town, so the youth says to his father, "I will now change myself into a beautiful horse, and you could sell me, but when you have sold me you must take off my bridle, or I cannot become a man again." Then the father goes with the horse to the fair, and the master thief comes and buys the horse for 100 thalers, but the father forgets and does not take off the bridle. So the man goes home with the horse and puts it in the stable. When the maid crosses the threshold, the horse says, "Take off my bridle, take off my bridle." Then the maid stands still and says, "Why canst thou speak?" So she goes and takes the bridle off, and the horse becomes a sparrow and flies out the door, and the wizard becomes a sparrow also and flies after him. Then they come together and cast lots, but the master loses, and betakes himself to the water and is a fish. Then the youth also becomes a fish, and they cast lots again, and the master loses. So the master changes himself into a cock, and the youth becomes a fox, and bites the master's head off, and he died, and has remained dead to this day. End of story number 68.
Story 69 of Household Tales. Jorinda and Joringel. There was once an old castle in the midst of a large and thick forest, and in it an old woman who was a witch dwelt all alone. In the daytime she changed herself into a cat or a screech owl, but in the evening she took her proper shape again as a human being. She could lure wild beasts and birds to her, and then she killed and boiled and roasted them. If anyone came within 100 paces of the castle, he was obliged to stand still, and could not stir from the place until she bade him be free. But whenever an innocent maiden came within this circle, she changed her into a bird, and shut her up in a wicker work cage, and carried the cage into a room in the castle. She had about 7,000 cages of rare birds in the castle. Now there was once a maiden who was called Jorinda, who was fairer than all other girls. She and a handsome youth named Joringel had promised to marry each other. They were still in the days of betrothal, and their greatest happiness was being together. One day, in order that they might be able to talk together in quiet, they went for a walk in the forest. "Take care," said Joringel, "that you do not go too near the castle." It was a beautiful evening. The sun shone brightly between the trunks of the trees into the dark green of the forest, and the turtle doves sang mournfully upon the young boughs of the birch trees. Jorinda wept now and then. She sat down in the sunshine and was sorrowful. Joringel was sorrowful too. They were as sad as if they were about to die. Then they looked around them and were quite at a loss, for they did not know by which way they should go home. The sun was still half above the mountain and half set. Joringel looked through the bushes and saw the old walls of the castle close at hand. He was horror-stricken and filled with deadly fear. Jorinda was singing, "My little bird with the necklace red sings sorrow, sorrow, sorrow. He sings that the dove must soon be dead, sings sorrow, sorrow, jug, jug, jug." Joringel looked for Jorinda. She was changed into a nightingale and sang jug, jug, jug. A screech owl with glowing eyes flew 3 times round about her, and 3 times cried, "Tu-woo, tu-woo, tu-woo." Joringel could not move. He stood there like a stone, and could neither weep nor speak, nor move hand or foot. The sun had now set. The owl flew into the thicket, and directly afterwards there came out of it a crooked old woman, yellow and lean, with large red eyes and a hooked nose, the point of which reached to her chin. She muttered to herself, caught the nightingale, and took it away in her hand. Joringel could neither speak nor move from the spot. The nightingale was gone. At last the woman came back, and said in a hollow voice, "Greet thee, Zachiel. If the moon shines on the cage, Zachiel, let him loose at once." Then Joringel was freed. He fell on his knees before the woman, and begged that she would give him back his Jorinda, but she said that he should never have her again, and went away. He called, he wept, he lamented, but all in vain. "Ah, what is to become of me?" Joringel went away, and at last came to a strange village. There he kept sheep for a long time. He often walked round and round the castle, but not too near to it. At last he dreamt one night that he found a blood-red flower, in the middle of which was a beautiful large pearl, that he picked the flower and went with it to the castle, and that everything he touched with the flower was freed from enchantment. He also dreamt that by means of it he recovered his Jorinda. In the morning, when he awoke, he began to seek over hill and dale if he could find such a flower. He sought until the 9th day, and then, early in the morning, he found the blood-red flower. In the middle of it there was a large dewdrop, as big as the finest pearl. Day and night he journeyed with his flower to the castle. When he was within 100 paces of it, he was not held fast, but walked on to the door. Joringel was full of joy. He touched the door with the flower, and it sprang open. He walked in through the courtyard, and listened for the sound of the birds. At last he heard it. He went on and found the room from whence it came, and there the witch was feeding the birds in the 7,000 cages. When she saw Joringel, she was angry, very angry, and scolded and spat poison and gall at him, but she could not come within 2 paces of him. He did not take any notice of her, but went and looked at the cages with the birds, but there were many 100 nightingales. How was he to find his Jorinda again? Just then he saw the old woman quietly take away a cage with a bird in it and go towards the door. Swiftly he sprang towards her, touched the cage with the flower, and also the old woman. She could now no longer bewitch anyone, and Jorinda was standing there, clasping him round the neck, and she was as beautiful as ever. End of story 69.
Story 70 of Household Tales. The 3 Sons of Fortune. A father once called his 3 sons before him, and he gave to the first a cock, to the second a scythe, and to the third a cat. "I am already aged," said he. "My death is nigh, and I have wished to take thought for you before my end. Money I have not, and what I now give you seems of little worth, but all depends on your making a sensible use of it. Only seek out a country where such things are still unknown, and your fortune is made." After the father's death, the eldest went away with his cock, but wherever he came the cock was already known. In the towns he saw him from a long distance, sitting upon the steeples and turning round with the wind, and in the villages he heard more than one crowing. No one would show any wonder at the creature, so that it did not look as if he would make his fortune by it. At last, however, it happened that he came to an island where the people knew nothing about cocks, and did not even understand how to divide their time. They certainly knew when it was morning or evening, but at night, if they did not sleep through it, not one of them knew how to find out the time. "Look," said he, "what a proud creature! It has a ruby-red crown upon its head, and wears spurs like a knight. It calls you 3 times during the night, at fixed hours, and when it calls for the last time, the sun soon rises. But if it crows by broad daylight, then take notice, for there will certainly be a change of weather. The people were well pleased. For a whole night they did not sleep, and listened with great delight as the cock at 2, 4, and 6 o'clock loudly and clearly proclaimed the time. They asked if the creature were for sale, and how much he wanted for it. About as much gold as an ass can carry, answered he, a ridiculously small price for such a precious creature. They cried unanimously, and willingly gave him what he asked. When he came home with his wealth, his brothers were astonished, and the second one said, "Well, I will go forth and see whether I cannot get rid of my scythe as profitably." But it did not look as if he would, for laborers met him everywhere, and they had scythes upon their shoulder as well as he. At last, however, he chanced upon an island where the people knew nothing of scythes. When the corn was ripe there, they took cannon out of the fields and shot it down. Now this was rather an uncertain affair. Many shot right over it. Others hit the ears instead of the stems, and shot them away, whereby much was lost, and beside all this, it made a terrible noise. So the man set to work and mowed it down so quietly and quickly that the people opened their mouths with astonishment. They agreed to give him what he wanted for the scythe, and he received a horse laden with as much gold as it could carry. And now the third brother wanted to take his cat to the right man. He fared just like the others. So long as he stayed on the mainland, there was nothing to be done. Every place had cats, and there were so many of them that newborn kittens were generally drowned in the ponds. At last he sailed over to an island, and it luckily happened that no cats had ever yet been seen there, and that mice had got the upper hand so much that they danced upon the tables and benches, whether the masters were at home or not. The people complained bitterly at the plague. The king himself in his palace did not know how to secure himself against them. Mice squeaked in every corner, and gnawed whatever they could lay hold of with their teeth. But now the cat began her chase, and soon cleared a couple of rooms, and the people begged the king to buy the wonderful beast for the country. The king willingly gave what was asked, which was a mule laden with gold, and the third brother came home with the greatest treasure of all. The cat made herself merry with the mice in the royal palace, and killed so many that they could not be counted. At last she grew warm with the work and thirsty, so she stood still, lifted up her head and cried, "Mew, mew." When they heard this strange cry, the king and all his people were frightened, and in their terror ran all at once out of the palace. Then the king took counsel what was best to be done. At last it was determined to send a herald to the cat, and demand that she should leave the palace, or if not, she was to expect that force would be used against her. The counselor said, "Rather, we will let ourselves be plagued with the mice, for to that misfortune we are accustomed, than give up our lives to such a monster as this." A noble youth, therefore, was sent to ask the cat whether she would peaceably quit the castle. But the cat, whose thirst had become still greater, merely answered, "Mew, mew." The youth understood her to say, "Most certainly not, most certainly not," and took this answer to the king. Then said the counselors, "She shall yield to force." Cannon were brought out, and the palace was soon in flames. When the fire reached the room where the cat was sitting, she sprang safely out of the window. But the besiegers did not leave off until the whole palace was shot down to the ground. End of story 70. Story 71 of Household Tales. How 6 men got on in the world. There was once a man who understood all kinds of arts. He served in the war and behaved well and bravely. But when the war was over, he received his dismissal, and 3 farthings for his expenses on the way. "Stop," said he, "I shall not be content with this. If I can only meet with the right people, the king will yet have to give me all the treasure of the country." Then, full of anger, he went into the forest and saw a man standing therein who had plucked up 6 trees as if they were blades of corn. He said to him, "Wilt thou be my servant and go with me?" "Yes," he answered, "but first I will take this little bundle of sticks home to my mother." And he took one of the trees and wrapped it round the 5 others, lifted the bundle on his back and carried it away. Then he returned and went with his master, who said, "We 2 ought to be able to get through the world very well." And when they had walked on for a short while, they found a huntsman who was kneeling and shouldering his gun and was about to fire. The master said to him, "Huntsman, what art thou going to shoot?" He answered, 2 miles from here is a fly sitting on the branch of an oak tree, and I want to shoot its left eye out." "Oh, come with me," said the man. "If we 3 are together, we certainly ought to be able to get on in the world." The huntsman was ready and went with him, and they came to 7 windmills, whose sails were turning round with great speed, and yet no wind was blowing either on the right or the left, and no leaf was stirring. Then said the man, "I know not what is driving the windmills, not a breath of air is stirring." And he went onwards with his servants, and when they had walked 2 miles, they saw a man sitting on a tree, who was shutting one nostril and blowing out of the other. "Good gracious, what are you doing up there?" He answered, 2 miles from here are 7 windmills. Look, I am blowing them till they turn round." "Oh, come with me," said the man. "If we 4 are together, we shall carry the whole world before us." Then the blower came down and went with him, and after a while they saw a man who was standing on one leg, and had taken off the other, and laid it beside him. Then the master said, "You have arranged things very comfortably to have a rest." "I am a runner," he replied, "and to stop myself running far too fast, I have taken off one of my legs, for if I run with both, I go quicker than any bird can fly." "Oh, go with me, and if we 5 are together, we shall carry the whole world before us." So he went with them, and it was not long before they met a man who wore a cap, but had put it quite on one ear. Then the master said to him, "Gracefully, gracefully, don't stick your cap on one ear. You look just like a tomfool." "I must not wear it otherwise," said he, "for if I set my hat straight, a terrible frost comes on, and all the birds in the air are frozen and drop dead on the ground." "Oh, come with me," said the master. "If we 6 are together, we can carry the whole world before us." Now the 6 came to town, where the king had proclaimed that whosoever ran a race with his daughter and won the victory should be her husband, but whosoever lost it must lose his head. Then the man presented himself and said, "I will, however, let my servant run for me." The king replied, "Then his life also must be staked, so that his head and thine are both set on the victory." When that was settled and made secure, the man buckled the other leg on the runner and said to him, "Now be nimble and help us to win." It was fixed that one who was first to bring some water from a far distant well was to be the victor. The runner received a pitcher, and the king's daughter won too, and they began to run at the same time. But on an instant, when the king's daughter had got a very little way, the people who were looking on could see no more of the runner, and it was just as if the wind had whistled by. In a short time he reached the well, filled his pitcher with water, and turned back. Halfway home, however, he was overcome with fatigue, and set his pitcher down, lay down himself, and fell asleep. He had, however, made a pillow of a horse's skull, which was laying on the ground, in order that he might lie uncomfortably and soon wake up again. In the meantime, the king's daughter, who could also run very well, quite as well as any ordinary mortal can, had reached the well and was hurrying back with her pitcher full of water. And when she saw the runner lying there asleep, she was glad and said, "My enemy is delivered over into my hands," emptied his pitcher, and ran on. And now all would have been lost if by good luck the huntsman had not been standing at the top of the castle, and had not seen everything with his sharp eyes. Then said he, "The king's daughter shall still not prevail against us." And he loaded his gun and shot so cleverly that he shot the horse's skull away from under the runner's head without hurting him. Then the runner awoke, leapt up, and saw that his pitcher was empty, and that the king's daughter was already far in advance. He did not lose heart, however, but ran back to the well with his pitcher, again drew some water, and was at home again, 10 minutes before the king's daughter. "Behold," said he, "I have not bestirred myself till now. It did not deserve to be called running before, but it pained the king, and still more his daughter, that she should be carried off by a common, disbanded soldier like that." So they took counsel with each other how to get rid of him and his companions. Then said the king to her, "I have thought of a way. Don't be afraid. They shall not come back again." And he said to them, "You shall now make merry together, and eat and drink." And he conducted them to a room which had a floor of iron, and the doors also were of iron, and the windows were guarded with iron bars. There was a table in the room covered with delicious food, and the king said to them, "Go in and enjoy yourselves." And when they were inside, he ordered the doors to be shut and bolted. Then he sent for the cook, and commanded him to make a fire under the room until the iron became red hot. This the cook did, and the 6 who were sitting at the table began to feel quite warm, and they thought the heat was caused by the food. But as it became still greater, and they wanted to get out, and found that the doors and windows were bolted, they became aware that the king must have an evil intention, and wanted to suffocate them. "He shall not succeed, however," said the one with the cap. "I will cause a frost to come, before which the fire shall be ashamed and creep away." Then he put his cap on straight, and immediately there came such a frost that all heat disappeared, and the food on the dishes began to freeze. When an hour or 2 had passed by, and the king believed that they had perished in the heat, he had the doors opened to behold them himself. But when the doors were opened, all 6 were standing there alive and well, and said that they should very much like to get out to warm themselves, for the very food was fast frozen to the dishes with the cold. Then, full of anger, the king went down to the cook, scolded him, and asked why he had not done what he had been ordered to do. But the cook replied, "There is heat enough there, just look for yourself." Then the king saw that a fierce fire was burning under the iron room, and perceived that there was no getting the better of the 6 in this way. Again the king considered how to get rid of his unpleasant guests, and caused their chief to be brought, and said, "If thou wilt take gold and renounce my daughter, thou shalt have as much as thou wilt." "Oh yes, Lord King," he answered, "give me as much as my servant can carry, and I will not ask for your daughter." On this the king was satisfied, and the other continued, "In 14 days I will come and fetch it." Thereupon he summoned together all the tailors in the whole kingdom, and they were to sit for 14 days and sew a sack. And when it was ready, the strong one who could tear up trees had to take it on his back, and go with it to the king. Then said the king, "Who can that strong fellow be who is carrying a bundle of linen on his back that is as big as a house?" And he was alarmed and said, "What a lot of gold he can carry." Then he commanded a ton of gold to be brought. It took 16 of his strongest men to carry it, but the strong one snatched it up in one hand, put it in his sack, and said, "Why don't you bring me more at the same time? That hardly covers the bottom." Then, little by little, the king caused all his treasure to be brought thither, and the strong one pushed it into the sack, and still the sack was not half full with it. "Bring more," cried he. "These few crumbs don't fill it." Then 7,000 carts with gold had to be gathered together in the whole kingdom, and the strong one thrust them and the oxen harnessed to them into his sack. "I will examine it no longer," said he, "but will just take what comes, so long as the sack is but full." When all that was inside, there was still room for a great deal more. Then he said, "I will just make an end of the thing." People do sometimes tie up a sack even when it is not full. So he took it on his back and went away with his comrades. When the king now saw how one single man was carrying away the entire wealth of the country, he became enraged, and bade his horsemen mount and pursue the 6, and ordered them to take the sack away from the strong one. 2 regiments speedily overtook the 6, and called out, "You are prisoners. Put down the sack with the gold, or you will be cut to pieces." "What say you," cried the blower, "that we are prisoners? Rather than that should happen, all of you shall dance about in the air." Then he closed one nostril, and with the other blew on the 2 regiments. Then they were driven away from each other and carried into the blue sky over all the mountains, one here, the other there. One sergeant cried for mercy. He had 9 wounds, and was a brave fellow who did not deserve ill treatment. The blower stopped a little so that he came down without injury. And when the blower said to him, "Now go home to thy king, and tell him he had better send some more horsemen, and I will blow them all into the air." When the king was informed of this, he said, "Oh, let the rascals go. They have the best of it." Then the 6 conveyed the riches home, divided it amongst them, and lived in content until their death. End of story 71.
Story number 72 of Household Tales. Once on a time the fox was talking to the wolf of the strength of man, how no animal could withstand him, and how all were obliged to employ cunning in order to preserve themselves from him. Then the wolf answered, "If I had but the chance of seeing a man for once, I would set on him notwithstanding." "I can help thee to do that," said the fox. "Come to me early tomorrow morning, and I will show thee one." The wolf presented himself betimes, and the fox took him out on the road by which the huntsman went daily. First came an old discharged soldier. "Is that a man?" inquired the wolf. "No," answered the fox, "that was one." Afterwards came a little boy who was going to school. "Is that a man?" "No, that is going to be one." At length came a hunter with his double-barreled gun at his back, and hanger by his side. Said the fox to the wolf, "Look, there comes a man. Thou must attack him, but I will take myself off to my hole." The wolf then rushed on the man. When the huntsman saw him, he said, "It is a pity that I have not loaded with a bullet," aimed and fired his small shot in his face. The wolf pulled a very wry face, but did not let himself be frightened, and attacked him again, on which the huntsman gave him a second barrel. The wolf swallowed his pain, and rushed on the huntsman, but he drew out his bright hanger, and gave him a few cuts with it, right and left, so that bleeding everywhere he ran howling back to the fox. "Well, brother wolf," said the fox, "hast thou got on with man?" "Ah," replied the wolf, "I never imagined the strength of man to be what it is. First he took a stick from his shoulder and blew into it, and then something flew into my face which tickled me terribly. Then he breathed once more into the stick, and it flew into my nose like lightning and hail. When I was quite close, he drew a white rib out of his side, and he beat me so with it that I was all but left lying dead." "See what a braggart thou art," said the fox. Thou throwest thy hatchet so far that thou canst not fetch it back again. End of story 72. Story number 73 of Household Tales. The Wolf and the Fox. The wolf had the fox with him, and whatsoever the wolf wished, that the fox was compelled to do, for he was the weaker, and he would gladly have been rid of his master. It chanced that once, as they were going through the forest, the wolf said, Red Fox, get me something to eat, or else I will eat thee thyself. Then the fox answered, I know a farmyard, where there are 2 young lambs. If thou art inclined, we will fetch one of them. That suited the wolf, and they went thither. And the fox stole the little lamb, took it to the wolf, and went away. The wolf devoured it, but was not satisfied with one. He wanted the other as well, and went to get it. As, however, he did it so awkwardly, the mother of the little lamb heard him, and began to cry out terribly, and to bleat so that the farmer came running there. They found the wolf and beat him so mercilessly that he went to the fox, limping and howling. Thou hast misled me finely, said he. I wanted to fetch the other lamb, and the country folk surprised me, and have beaten me to a jelly. The fox replied, Why art thou such a glutton? Next day they again went into the country, and the greedy wolf once more said, Red Fox, get me something to eat, or I will eat thee thyself. Then answered the fox, I know a farmhouse where the wife is baking pancakes tonight. We will get some of them for ourselves. They went there, and the fox slipped around the house and peeped and sniffed about until he discovered where the dish was, and then drew down 6 pancakes and carried them to the wolf. There is something for thee to eat, said he to him, and then went his way. The wolf swallowed down the pancakes in an instant, and said, They make one want more, and went thither and tore the whole dish down so that it broke in pieces. This made such a great noise that the woman came out, and when she saw the wolf, she called the people, who hurried there and beat him as long as their sticks would hold together, till with 2 lame legs and howling loudly he got back to the fox in the forest. How abominably thou hast misled me, cried he. The peasants caught me and tanned my skin for me. But the fox replied, Why art thou such a glutton? On the 3rd day, when they were out together, and the wolf could only limp along painfully, he again said, Red Fox, get me something to eat, or I will eat thee thyself. The fox answered, I know a man who has been killing, and the salted meat is lying in a barrel in the cellar. We will get that. Said the wolf, I will go when thou dost, that thou mayest help me if I am not able to get away. I am willing, said the fox, and showed him the bypaths and the ways by which at length they reached the cellar. There was meat in abundance, and the wolf attacked it instantly and thought, There is plenty of time before I need leave off. The fox liked it also, but looked about everywhere, and often ran to the hole by which they had come in, and tried if his body was still thin enough to slip through it. The wolf said, Dear fox, tell me why thou art running here and there so much, and jumping in and out. I must see that no one is coming, replied the crafty fellow. Don't eat too much. Then said the wolf, I shall not leave until the barrel is empty. In the meantime, the farmer who had heard the noise of the fox's jumping came into the cellar. When the fox saw him, he was out of the hole at one bound. The wolf wanted to follow him, but he had made himself so fat with eating that he could no longer get through, but stuck fast. Then came the farmer with a cudgel and struck him dead. But the fox bounded into the forest, glad to be rid of the old glutton. End of story number 73. Story number 74 of Household Tales. Story number 74, The Fox and His Cousin. The she-wolf brought forth a young one, and invited the fox to be godfather. After all, he is a near relative of ours, said she. He has a good understanding and much talent. He can instruct my little son, and help him forward in the world. The fox, too, appeared quite honest, and said, Worthy Mrs. Gossip, I thank you for the honor which you are doing me. I will, however, conduct myself in such a way that you shall be repaid for it. He enjoyed himself at the feast and made merry. Afterwards he said, Dear Mrs. Gossip, it is our duty to take care of the child. It must have good food that it may be strong. I know a sheepfold, from which we might fetch a nice morsel. The wolf was pleased with the ditty, and she went out with the fox to the farmyard. He pointed out the fold from afar, and said, You will be able to creep in there without being seen, and in the meantime I will look about on the other side to see if I can pick up a chicken." He, however, did not go there, but sat down at the entrance to the forest, stretched his legs, and rested. The she-wolf crept into the stable. A dog was lying there, and it made such a noise that the peasants came running out, caught Gossip Wolf, and poured a strong burning mixture, which had been prepared for washing, over her skin. At last she escaped and dragged herself outside. There lay the fox, who pretended to be full of complaints, and said, "Ah, dear Mistress Gossip, how ill I have fared! The peasants have fallen on me, and have broken every limb I have. If you do not want me to lie where I am and perish, you must carry me away." The she-wolf herself was only able to go away slowly, but she was in such concern about the fox that she took him on her back and slowly carried him perfectly safe and sound to her house. Then the fox cried to her, "Farewell, dear Mistress Gossip. May the roasting you have had do you good," laughed heartily at her, and bounded off. End of story number 74. Story number 75 of Household Tales. Story number 75, The Fox and the Cat. It happened that the cat met the fox in the forest, and as she thought to herself, "He is clever and full of experience, and much esteemed in the world," she spoke to him in a friendly way. "Good day, dear Mr. Fox. How are you? How is all with you? How are you getting through this dear season?" The fox, full of all kinds of arrogance, looked at the cat from head to foot, and for a long time did not know whether he would give any answer or not. At last he said, "O thou wretched beard cleaner, thou piebald fool, thou hungry mouse hunter, what canst thou be thinking of? Dost thou venture to ask how I am getting on? What hast thou learnt? How many arts dost thou understand?" "I understand but one," replied the cat modestly. "What art is that?" asked the fox. "When the hounds are following me, I can spring into a tree and save myself." "Is that all?" said the fox. "I am a master of 100 arts, and have into the bargain a sack full of cunning. Thou makest me sorry for thee. Come with me, I will teach thee how people get away from the hounds." Just then came a hunter with 4 dogs. The cat sprang nimbly up a tree and sat down on top of it, where the branches and foliage quite concealed her. "Open your sack, Mr. Fox, open your sack," cried the cat to him, but the dogs had already seized him and were holding him fast. "Ah, Mr. Fox," cried the cat, "you with your 100 arts are left in the lurch. Had you been able to climb like me, you would not have lost your life." End of story number 75.
Story 76 of Household Tales, The Pink. There was once on a time a queen to whom God had given no children. Every morning she went into the garden and prayed to God in heaven to bestow on her a son or a daughter. Then an angel from heaven came to her and said, "Be at rest, and thou shalt have a son with the power of wishing, so that whatsoever in the world he wishes for, that shall he have." Then she went to the king and told him the joyful tidings. And when the time was come, she gave birth to a son, and the king was filled with gladness. Every morning she went with the child to the garden where the wild beasts were kept, and washed herself there in a clear stream. It happened once, when the child was a little older, that it was lying in her arms, and she fell asleep. Then came the old cook, who knew that the child had the power of wishing, and stole it away. And he took a hen and cut it in pieces, and dropped some of its blood on the queen's apron and on her dress. Then he carried the child away to a secret place, where a nurse was obliged to suckle it. And he ran to the king and accused the queen of having allowed her child to be taken from her by the wild beasts. When the king saw the blood on her apron, he believed this, fell into such a passion, that he ordered a high tower to be built, on which neither sun nor moon could be seen, and had his wife put into it, and walled up. Here she was to stay for 7 years, without meat or drink, and die of hunger. But God sent 2 angels from heaven in the shape of white doves, which flew to her twice a day, and carried her food until the 7 years were over. The cook, however, thought to himself, if the child has the power of wishing, and I am here, he might very easily get me into trouble. So he left the palace and went to the boy, who was already big enough to speak, and said to him, Wish for a beautiful palace for thyself with a garden, and all else that pertains to it. Scarcely were the words out of the boy's mouth when everything was there that he had wished for. After a while the cook said to him, It is not well for thee to be so alone. Wish for a pretty girl as a companion. Then the king's son wished for one, and she immediately stood before him, and was more beautiful than any painter could have painted her. The two played together and loved each other with all their hearts, and the old cook went out hunting like a nobleman. The thought, however, occurred to him that the king's son might some day wish to be with his father, and thus bring him into great peril. So he went out and took the maiden aside and said, Tonight, when the boy is asleep, go to his bed, and plunge this knife into his heart, and bring me his heart and tongue, and if thou dost not do it, thou shalt lose thy life. Thereupon he went away, and when he returned the next day, she had not done it, and said, Why should I shed the blood of an innocent boy, who has never harmed anyone? The cook once more said, If thou dost not do it, it shall cost thee thy own life. When he had gone away, she had a little hind brought to her, and ordered her to be killed, and took her heart and tongue and laid them on a plate. And when she saw the old man coming, she said to the boy, Lie down in the bed and draw the clothes over thee. Then the wicked wretch came in and said, Where are the boy's heart and tongue? The girl reached the plate to him, but the king's son drew off the quilt and said, Thou old sinner, why dost thou want to kill me? Now I will pronounce thy sentence. Thou shalt become a black poodle, and have a gold collar round thy neck, and shalt eat burning coals, till the flames burst forth from thy throat. And when he had spoken these words, the old man was changed into a poodle dog, and had a gold collar around his neck. And the cooks were ordered to bring up some live coals, and these he ate until the flames broke forth from his throat. The king's son remained there a short while longer, and he thought of his mother, and wondered if she were still alive. And at length he said to the maiden, I will go home to my own country. If thou wilt go with me, I will provide for thee. Ah, she replied, the way is so long, and what shall I do in a strange land where I am unknown? As she did not seem quite willing, and as they could not be parted from each other, he wished that she might be changed into a beautiful pink, and he took her with him. Then he went away to his own country, and the poodle had to run after him. He went to the tower in which his mother was confined, and as it was so high, he wished for a ladder, which would reach up to the very top. Then he mounted up and looked inside, and cried, Beloved mother, lady queen, are you still alive, or are you dead? She answered, I have just eaten, and am still satisfied, for she thought that the angels were there. Said he, I am your dear son, whom the wild beasts were said to have torn from your arms, but I am alive still, and will speedily deliver you. Then he descended again, and went to his father, and caused himself to be announced as a strange huntsman, and asked if he could give him a place. The king said yes, if he was skillful, and could get some gain for him, he should come to him. But that deer had never taken up their quarters in any part of the district or country. Then the huntsman promised to procure as much game for him as he could possibly use for the royal table. So he summoned all the huntsmen together, and bade them go out into the forest with him. and he went with them and made them form a great circle, open at one end, where he stationed himself and began to wish. 200 deer and more came running inside the circle at once, and the huntsman shot them. Then they were all placed on 60 country carts and driven home to the king, and for once he was able to deck his table with game, after having had none at all for years. Now the king felt great joy at this, and commanded that his entire household should eat with him the next day, and made a great feast. When they were all assembled together, he said to the huntsman, "As thou art so clever, thou shalt sit by me." He replied, "Lord King, your majesty must excuse me. I am a poor huntsman." But the king insisted on it and said, "Thou shalt sit by me," until he did it. Whilst he was sitting there, he thought of his dearest mother, and wished that one of the king's principal servants would begin to speak of her, and would ask how it was faring with the queen in the tower, and if she were still alive, or had perished. Hardly had he formed the wish, than the marshal began and said, "Your Majesty, we live joyously here, but how is the queen living in the tower? Is she still alive, or has she died?" But the king replied, "She let my dear son be torn to pieces by wild beasts. I will not have her named." Then the huntsman arose and said, "Gracious Lord Father, she is alive still, and I am her son, and I was not carried away by wild beasts, but by that wretch the old cook, who tore me from her arms when she was asleep, and sprinkled her apron with the blood of a chicken." Thereupon he took the dog with the golden collar and said, "That is the wretch," and caused live coals to be brought, and these the dog was compelled to devour before the sight of all, until flames burst forth from its throat. On this the huntsman asked the king if he would like to see the dog in his true shape, and wished him back into the form of the cook, in the which he stood immediately, with his white apron, and his knife by his side. When the king saw him, he fell into a passion, and ordered him to be cast into the deepest dungeon. Then the huntsman spoke further and said, "Father, will you see the maiden who brought me up so tenderly, and who was afterwards to murder me, but did not do it, though her own life depended on it?" The king replied, "Yes, I would like to see her." The son said, "Most gracious father, I will show her to you in the form of a beautiful flower." And he thrust his hand into his pocket, and brought forth the pink, and placed it on the royal table, and it was so beautiful that the king had never seen one equal to it. Then the son said, "Now will I show her to you in her true form," and wished that she might become a maiden. And she stood there looking so beautiful that no painter could have made her look more so. And the king sent 2 waiting maids and 2 attendants into the tower to fetch the queen and bring her to the royal table. But when she was led in, she ate nothing and said, "The gracious and merciful God, who has supported me in the tower, will speedily deliver me." She lived 3 days more and then died happily. And when she was buried, the 2 white doves which had brought her food to the tower and were angels of heaven followed her body and seated themselves on her grave. The aged king ordered the cook to be torn in 4 pieces, but grief consumed the king's own heart, and soon he died. His son married the beautiful maiden whom he had brought with him as a flower in his pocket, and whether they are still alive or not is known to God. End of story 76. Story 77 of Household Tales. Clever Grethel. There was once a cook named Grethel, who wore shoes with red rosettes, and when she walked out with them on, she turned herself this way and that, and thought, "You certainly are a pretty girl." And when she came home, she drank, in her gladness of heart, a draught of wine. And as wine excites a desire to eat, she tasted the best of whatever she was cooking until she was satisfied and said, "The cook must know what the food is like." It came to pass that the master one day said to her, "Grethel, there is a guest coming this evening. Prepare me 2 fowls daintily." "I will see to it, master," answered Grethel. She killed 2 fowls, scalded them, plucked them, put them on the spit, and towards evening set them before the fire, that they might roast. The fowls began to turn brown, and were nearly ready, but the guest had not yet arrived. Then Grethel called out to her master, "If the guest does not come, I must take the fowls away from the fire, but it will be a sin and a shame if they are not eaten directly, when they are juiciest." The master said, "I will run myself and fetch the guest." When the master had turned his back, Grethel laid the spit with the fowls on one side, and thought, "Standing so long by the fire there makes one hot and thirsty. Who knows when they will come? Meanwhile, I will run into the cellar and take a drink." She ran down, set a jug, and said, "God bless it to thy use, Grethel," and took a good drink, and took yet another hearty draught. Then she went and put the fowls down again to the fire, basted them, and drove the spit merrily around. But as the roast meat smelled so good, Grethel thought something might be wrong. It ought to be tasted. She touched it with her finger and said, "Ah, how good fowls are! It certainly is a sin and a shame that they are not eaten directly." She ran to the window to see if the master was not coming with his guest, but she saw no one, and went back to the fowls and thought, "One of the wings is burning. I'd better take it off and eat it." So she cut it off, ate it, and enjoyed it. And when she had done, she thought, "The other must go down too, or else master will observe that something is missing." When the 2 wings were eaten, she went and looked for her master, but did not see him. It suddenly occurred to her, "Who knows? They are perhaps not coming at all, and have turned in somewhere." Then she said, "Hello, Grethel, enjoy yourself. 1 fowl has been cut in 2. Take another drink and eat it up entirely. When it is eaten, you will have some peace. Why should God's good gifts be spoilt?" So she ran into the cellar again, took an enormous drink, and ate up the 1 chicken in great glee. When one of the chickens was swallowed down, and still her master did not come, Grethel looked at the other and said, "Where one is, the other should be likewise. The 2 go together. What's right for the one is right for the other. I think if I were to take another draught, it would do me no harm." So she took another hearty drink, and let the second chicken rejoin the first. When she was just in the best of the eating, her master came and cried, "Hurry up! Haste thee, Grethel! The guest is coming directly after me." "Yes, sir, I will soon serve up," answered Grethel. Meantime the master looked to see that the table was properly laid, and took the great knife, wherewith he was going to carve the chickens, and sharpened it on the steps. Presently the guest came, and knocked politely and courteously at the house door. Grethel ran and looked to see who was there, and when she saw the guest, she put her finger to her lips and said, "Hush, hush! Get away as quickly as you can. If my master catches you, it will be the worse for you. He certainly did ask you to supper, but his intention is to cut off your 2 ears. Just listen how he is sharpening the knife for it." The guest heard the sharpening and hurried down the steps again as fast as he could. Grethel was not idle. She ran screaming to her master and cried, "You have invited a fine guest." Why, Grethel? What do you mean by that?" "Yes," said she, "he has taken the chickens which I was just going to serve up. off the dish and has run away with them." "That's a nice trick," said her master, and lamented the fine chickens. "If he had but left me one, so that something remained for me to eat." He called to him to stop, but the guest pretended not to hear. Then he ran after him with the knife still in his hand, crying, just one," meaning that the guest should leave him just one chicken, and not take both. The guest, however, thought no otherwise than that he was to give up one of his ears, and ran as fast as if fire were burning under him, in order to take them both home with him. End of story 77.